none of my doctors had ever really told me that that you could make changes like that. It was always just, eat whatever you want, do whatever you want, just give yourself more insulin if you need it.
I remember you sharing about a chart they gave you with just like the carbohydrates in fast food, right?
Yeah, it was a whole
A
book
book.
actually, that just listed pretty much every item on the fast food menu of any fast food restaurant and how many carbs were in it, because that was the whole thing. You counted carbohydrates and you gave insulin for your carbohydrates. Every time I heard about heart disease, my ears would perk up and I'd soak it in, and eventually started doing my own research and found a lot of things that I had been told that were wrong. And so we now know those bacteria that are good at using oxygen to make ATP that the other bacteria engulf. We now know them as mitochondria. And mitochondria do have a lot of characteristics that suggest they used to be independent living beings themselves.
Stephen Hussey, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I was just telling you offline that I enjoyed your book very much. We're going to put a link for it in the notes of the podcast. It's called Understanding the Heart, Uncommon Insights into Our Most Commonly Diseased Organ. And how true is that? I mean, we're going to bust a lot of myths today, get into a great conversation about the heart and heart disease in general. Before we get to that, let's go back in time a little bit. You were a teenager, you were in high school, and you got your A1C levels tested, and it was 11.2. What led up to that point? What changed after that?
Well, immediately after that, probably not too much change. At that point, I was, I guess a typical rebellious teenager, and my parents were concerned about me, obviously, and my health, and so they were just all over me about controlling blood sugars, and I just couldn't see the future. I couldn't see what that would cause down the line. And but when I got into college, I had a really good relationship with my pediatric endocrinologist. Looking back, I don't necessarily agree with everything that he recommended, but he was a great person, and he really helped me understand the disease. And so that kind of inspired me to want to be some sort of medical practitioner. And so when I started learning about that stuff in college, I also started realizing that the way I live my life in lifestyle had a direct impact on my ability to manage type 1 diabetes, but also all the inflammatory conditions I had as a child, whether it was asthma or allergies or chronic hives or IBS, all this kind of stuff. And all that stuff's pretty much gone now. And so I started to see this correlation with, direct, feedback into how I live my life and affecting my ability to manage these things. And I found it curious that none of my doctors had ever really told me that you could make changes like that. It was always just, eat whatever you want, do whatever you want, just give yourself more insulin if you need it. And
about that point, I remember you sharing about a chart they gave you with just like the carbohydrates in fast food, right?
Yeah, it was a whole book actually, that just listed pretty much every item on the fast food menu of any fast food restaurant, and how many carbs were in it, because that was the whole thing. You counted carbohydrates and you gave insulin for your carbohydrates. That's how you manage the condition according to them. And so that's what I did for a long time, unsuccessfully a lot of times. But yeah, so when I started to realize that, it was a lot of trial and error. I was figuring out stuff on my own, but I was also starting to get educated on, these things. I majored in health and wellness in college, and then went on to chiropractic school and then a master's in human nutrition. And so all that stuff was great, and it gave me a great baseline. But what I've learned since then surpasses that even, and it's just been this never-ending kind of journey into how I can best manage these things.
Yeah, very fascinating. It's so sad that they were just focusing on one macronutrient, yet you could have all the vegetable oils and inflammatory fats. Like, what about that? How is that contributing to your type 1 diabetes? So you went to school for health and wellness. You became a chiropractor. I have a big love for chiropractors. I work with a lot of them on my team. I work with my mentor, Dr. Daniel Pompa, who was a chiropractor. And I love the philosophy of chiropractors, because the philosophy is identify interference, remove interference, allow the body to heal. And I truly believe we have this innate intelligence within us that is designed to help us heal. And you decided after several years of research to write a book about the heart. And your book is very different than other books written about the heart. But why did you decide to focus on the heart?
Yeah, I just throughout my childhood and then college and becoming an adult, like I would always go to endocrinologists, and I just remember seeing all over the walls of the clinics all these posters that say, diabetics are 2 to 4 times increased risk of heart disease, and going blind and amputations and all this stuff. And every time I'd ask, my doctors, why that was, they just say, oh, because higher blood sugars over time will, lead to glycation issues and damage, and then damage the arteries, and the small arteries are the ones that get damaged first. And so I was like, oh man, cardiovascular disease. Like when I started getting into health, I was like, that's got to be my focus, because that's what I'm predisposed to heavily. And so I just started trying to learn as much as I could. Every time I heard about heart disease, my ears would perk up and I'd soak it in, and eventually started doing my own research, and found a lot of things that I had been told that were wrong, and it was just kind of like my personal journey. And then I guess about 3 years ago now, or maybe even 4 years ago now, I started sharing some of my findings about the heart on social media and stuff, and people seem to like it. And so I decided to put it all down in one place and in this book, and here it is.
I'm glad that you did. So are so many other people out there. The book gets you talk about a lot of different things in the book, but you went into the history of the beginning of life, the history of the mitochondria, the history of the autonomic nervous system. Let's start there. What did you discover when you were looking at the beginning of life?
Yeah. And I think that, the overarching thing here is that, like, this is a book about heart disease and the heart and understanding the heart. But in reality, it's a book about health. Any of these things, all these imbalances I talk about with heart disease are the same things that cause other diseases. So all this applies to pretty much the body in general and health in general. But yeah, so I came across this interesting theory by a guy named Jeremy England at MIT, I believe. And basically, he just describes that, in the beginning, when it was just this primordial soup, and it was just the Earth was absorbing energy from the sun, and eventually that energy got to be so much that the small little primordial soup, these molecules of things started to combine themselves into the first living things, little bacteria, and things like that, and probionts, that's what they're called. And so eventually that kind of started life, and life just started growing into more complex organisms over time. And that was because life was getting more efficient at absorbing and, I guess, harvesting energy from the environment and storing it. So basically it was helping the earth store energy, because the earth is constantly getting this supply of energy and it needed something to do with it. And so that's his theory as to why life, um, I guess, came about, because the earth needed some way of storing energy. So that's what we are. We're energy storing things. So are trees, so are insects. They're all just ways of storing energy in a transient fashion, And so eventually, though, early on in that, in life, there was these, different bacteria. Some were good at using carbon dioxide, some were better at using oxygen. And so when oxygen started becoming to the atmosphere, when photosynthesis started happening, two of these bacteria kind of teamed up. And one of them was a bacteria that wasn't so good at harvesting oxygen from the environment. The other one was, and using the oxygen to make energy. And so the theory goes that the one that got kind of engulfed in this other bacteria, and now it was doing a job for that bacteria, and that was able to use oxygen to make ATP, so that cell could focus on doing other things, like becoming multicellular and doing other cellular functions. And so we now know those bacteria that are good at using oxygen to make ATP that the other bacteria engulf. We now know them as mitochondria. And mitochondria do have a lot of characteristics, I guess, that suggest they used to be independent living beings themselves, being at a double mitochondrial membrane, or even the fact that they've even found mitochondria on their own in the human body, like by themselves, outside the cells. So they can, be on their own. And so it was this relationship that kind of, I guess, stood the test of time, because it's still present in us today. But it's really relevant to the heart, because the heart's metabolism is very, very important, and the heart tissue is some of the most mitochondrial dense tissue in the body. So it's really important that the mitochondria are functioning properly.
Do you know how many mitochondria on average are in a single heart cell?
I do not.
Yeah, I know it's up there because it's one of the most metabolically demanding
Right.
cells, along with the brain cells and the eyeballs. And you know what I discovered, Stephen? The highest concentration of mitochondria in a single cell is actually in the ovaries, and
Wow.
100,000 mitochondria in a single cell, which makes a lot of sense to me because everything we're talking about when it comes to the mitochondria, survival, right?
Right.
Eyeballs, looking around, surviving. The heart, of course, you need your heart to live,
Hmm.
and then reproduction with the ovaries. So it's super fascinating the way that we were designed. It's really really magnificent.
Yeah.
So the mitochondria. Let's talk about that in relation to disease, heart disease. Heart disease, is it number two of the number in terms of deaths in the U.S.? Is it number two after cancer?
I think it goes back and forth.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's heart disease, sometimes cancer. They're very close, but I think heart disease is first if you include like all the diseases of heart disease, like atherosclerosis, heart failure, heart attacks, all those different ones. Yeah.
So it's one or two. It's flopping back and forth. It's very high. It's off the charts. To your point about diabetes, most people who die from diabetes are not actually dying from diabetes. They're dying from the degeneration of it, the heart attacks, the strokes, kidney failure, etc. What role does the mitochondria, or I should say, impaired mitochondria, play with these diseases?
Yeah. So specifically in the heart, it seems to have, and most organs in general in the body seem to have this preference for burning fatty acids and ketones for fuel. And there's really interesting studies specifically on heart tissue that show that, like even in the presence of glucose, the heart still chooses to burn ketones and fatty acids if they're available. And I think there's mechanisms in place that kind of give the heart first dibs on fatty acids and ensure that it has enough fatty acids and ketones around. And so, to me, that means that it needs to be generating the most ATP possible because you get way more ATP burning fatty acids and ketones than you do glucose. You can burn glucose pretty efficiently and fast, but you don't get as much energy from it. And
Plus,
so
less cellular smoke, if you will, toxins.
Right. Yeah. So exhaust, so to
Yeah.
speak. Burning fatty acids, you get less of that exhaust or free radicals, and so that's very important because if we get lots of that exhaust, we start to get damage to the mitochondria, and when the mitochondria get damaged, then they can't function as well. They can't use oxygen as well, and as that causes them to go from oxidative phosphorylation to more of like a fermentation kind of thing, where they can't, it's called aerobic fermentation, where in the presence of oxygen they choose to go to fermentation even though it's present, but it's because the organs that allow them to use oxygen aren't operating properly, which is those mitochondria. They're damaged, and so that can lead to whole host of things. But it seems that the heart has this kind of special protection from that situation. It can still happen though, unfortunately, and there's things I talk about in the book that lead to that. But it seems that the body's kind of put this it put that first, so that the heart can keep functioning because obviously it's a pretty important organ. It's what delivers all our nutrients and everything, so to speak.
Yeah, so interesting. And it goes back to Otto Warburg and his metabolic theory of cancer. Now that we have Dr. Thomas Seyfried and others kind of carrying that work, the fermentation process, this in which we don't want, because that'll lead to disease, it'll lead to cancer. So let's transition here. I talk a lot about, of course, keto. I love keto. Love going in and out of ketosis. I also love carnivore. I like using carnivore as a tool, short term, personally, and for my students. Red meat. I mean, there's so many studies out there that are so conflicting. And you talked about in your book living in big cities versus rural areas, and you kind of compare that to some of the red meat studies out there. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, particularly the one that I talk about in the book is the China study, which is that infamous one, I say.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they did find, these are all associations, so they can't really tell us much of anything anyways. They can just tell us that things are associated together. They can't say that one thing caused the other. But in this, big study, the China study, which is kind of famous, I guess, in these circles. They found that people who ate more red meat had higher incidences of heart disease. But when you look at the data, the people who ate more red meat were people who lived in cities in general. And so an associational study cannot flesh out the differences between someone who lives in a city and lives in a rural area. And so, if I think about cities, there's way more toxin exposure. It's way more, usually more stressful lifestyle, more high demand. We got, exec CEOs, busier life, things like that. In the rural areas, it's a little bit slower. All different kinds of things like that. I'd think more processed food in a city, where in rural areas you probably have access to more, fresher, more whole foods. And so all those differences can't be fleshed out. So you can't say, okay, so it was the red meat that caused the issue, and these groups of people lived in totally different environments. And so that's one of my biggest, I guess, critiques of studies like that, and of the China study specifically, is that it didn't account for that, and it just went based off that one association, and then kind of made recommendations and went with it from there.
Yeah, which makes the book pretty much flawed. If only
Yeah.
they would have had that in asterisk, or like have some sort of caveat, like, by the way, we were not sure because we didn't separate the rural versus the big cities. By the way, the China study duped me back in 2012, 2013. I became a vegan for a year and a half because I read that book before I knew how to understand studies. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on red meat?
I think it's one, if not the best, one of the best foods for human beings. I think that it's it's a food that is some of the most nutrient dense, most bioavailable, meaning your body can absorb the nutrients in it very easily. It doesn't have to deal with anything bound to cellulose or any type of, plant molecule that's interfering with absorption or anything like that. So it's in a world where we have a population that is extremely undernourished as far as vitamins, minerals, even protein. Like that is probably the most important food for people to be getting, when it comes to fixing this problem of overfed and undernourished, that we have. And so, to me, to blame it, or to say that we need to get rid of animal foods or get rid of animal farming. We need to do better animal farming, but to get rid of it is just not an option. Not for the health and future of humans, but also not for the health of the planet either. Like we need red meat. We need the animals that red meat comes from. And when it comes to heart disease, humans have been eating red meat since the beginning of humans, since the first modern humans arrived. And so it makes no sense that it would be killing us, because heart disease is a relatively, at least in the epidemic that we know of it as, it's only been around for 150 years or so. Like we have evidence of heart disease much older than that, like in ancient Egypt. But it's very well known that the Egyptians were very very little red meat, and they were a grain-based society. So yeah, like we see that the numbers skyrocket, and we can't blame it on something that's been part of the human diet for millions of years when the disease rate skyrocketed in the last 150. That just doesn't make sense at all. And so that, combined with the fact that when you look at certain nutrients that come almost exclusively from meat and red meat, whether it be pork or red meat specifically, there's nutrients in there that are extremely good for the heart, like carnitine, creatine, carnosine, taurine, all these nutrients that you can try and get them from plants, but good luck. You need to get enough. You're going to need to eat animal foods. So why would a food that has so many beneficial nutrients to the heart also be killing the heart? That doesn't make sense.
Agreed. And of course, we want quality grass-fed, grass-finished, regenerative farming. We want to support that. So I agree 100%. The vegan movement is very strong nowadays. The marketing is really good. They get an A+ in marketing, but a poor grade in actual health. So I'm glad that you shared that, because I've tested my lab work, and I want to get into that with you. I've tested a comprehensive lab work before 40 days of strict carnivore, just nothing but animal fat and protein, and then 40 days after, and it transformed my lab work, my inflammatory markers, my hormones change in a positive way. So when we're looking at assessing our risk of heart disease and we're looking at the ketogenic approach or carnivore approach that we're following, how do we actually get some lab markers done to verify? What are some of your go-to lab markers in perspective of heart disease?
Yeah. So like when people, if they get my book and read it, they'll find that there's this three-pronged approach for me, and that is, metabolic health or metabolic flexibility, and low inflammation and oxidative stress, and balance in our autonomic nervous system. And so those first two, metabolic flexibility and oxidative stress, you can assess fairly easily with blood work. And so, the numbers that I like to use, just kind of as a baseline thing, are the trig to HDL ratio. So you take that triglycerides divided by HDL, and that should be 1.5 or lower, ideally.
Oh, you say 1.5. I've been going off of less than 2. So you like 1.5 a little bit better.
Yeah, I like 1.5 or lower.
Okay.
And then the other one is the insulin resistance score, or just really the fasting insulin in general, because if you're a little bit insulin resistant or have poor metabolic health, that'll show up way before blood sugar will be elevated. So that's really important, because someone could have high fasting insulin for 20 years before the blood sugar ever ends up abnormal. And so, most physicians are waiting for the blood sugar to end up abnormal before they can diagnose you with diabetes or prediabetes or something like that. And they never even looked at the fasting insulin. So it's important, because if fasting insulin is elevated, then that means your body is having to use more insulin to keep your blood sugar normal, which means that you're insulin resistant. So you can see that way before it becomes, pathologic, I'd say. And so
you like that in single digits, fasting insulin?
Yeah. So I usually say below 10 is good, below 5 is great.
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously you don't want it like extremely too low, but like, yeah, somewhere in there is pretty good. But you can also, take that number, multiply it by the blood sugar and divide it by 405, and that gives you your insulin resistance score, which again should be 1.5 or lower.
Say that again. So you take your fasting insulin and then multiply it by your what?
Your blood sugar, the fasting blood sugar.
Fasting blood sugar.
Panel, and divide it by 405.
Okay, got it. I'm gonna put that in the notes, and then that's your insulin resistance score.
Yeah.
What do you want that?
1.5 or lower.
5 or lower. That's great. So those listening, write that down and get that done. Do you put much emphasis on C-peptide to look at specifically the beta cells in the pancreas?
Yeah, I mean, you could, just to see, how much function there is there, but I almost feel like that would be like, for that to be a normal, you'd have to be in a real pathologic state, so I want to detect things before it becomes a problem like that. Because with my C-peptide, it's like they're not working at all at this point.
Yeah.
They haven't been for a long time. When I was first diagnosed, they were probably still working a little bit, my beta cells, but now they're not. Yeah. So, and like I like to keep it as simple as possible too. Like, hey, this is a number we got to fix. We don't need 4 other numbers that tell us the same thing. Let's fix these right here. We're going to be doing good. And then the other thing is inflammation and oxidative stress. And you can get like, into the weeds with all the different numbers you could take on blood work that give you an idea of, damage to tissues and things like that. But, a good baseline inflammatory marker screening thing, it's just HSCRP, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. So, but you could also do things like GGT. You could look at different markers that tell you about damage to certain fats in the body, or damage to DNA in the body, which could be a better assessment of like actual oxidative stress within cells. So there's different things you could take, but like I said, you really get into the weeds. You could spend a lot of money doing that kind of stuff when in reality, you could just do a few tests and see those numbers, try and work to improve those. If you still don't feel better or get results or whatever, then maybe you could look deeper, but I would start there.
That's a great list. It's a great baseline. For C-reactive protein, do you want to see that below 1? What's your optimal range?
I usually say below 2 is good, below 1 is great. Yeah.
Okay. When I first did my carnivore, one of the markers was the high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And it was 1.1 on day 1. I was already doing keto. I had been doing keto for years. And then I did 40 days of carnivore, and it dropped down to 0.5. So that kind of flies in the face of conventional wisdom that says eating more animal fat, saturated fat, cholesterol is going to increase your chances of heart disease. I saw the exact opposite.
Yeah, exactly. And I see that all the time with clients and stuff, and myself too. When I've done carnivore diets, it's like point 0.2 or something like that,
Yeah.
which is good for me, great for me because I have type 1, so my blood sugars are going to be higher. They're going to be causing glycation stuff. So yeah, I'm really pleased with that. But the other thing about blood work to remember is that these are good, like, I guess, guidance tools, but they're not the end all be all. And I think that the perfect lesson is like a carnivore diet, or is like a even a ketogenic diet, where someone's like, what Dave Feldman calls lean mass hyper responders. Like, sometimes things can, markers can go elevated or something like that. But if we take that in the context of everything else that's going on with the person, with the rest of the blood work, then we see that, maybe this is a good thing. And just because, our normal ranges that the lab gives us on the side, this is the normal range, says this, and we're out of that range, but we feel amazing. We feel the healthiest we felt in 10 years. Like, what are we gonna believe? Is the blood work going to tell us we're unhealthy, or is the way we feel going to tell us, how our health is? And so that's not to say ignore blood work. It's a tool that we should use. But I do think that it's a bit short-sighted to just focus on that, and to live and die by it too.
No, well said. I agree. Speaking of which, my LDL went through the roof when I did carnivore, but all the other things improved. So if we look at it from that picture, and I felt great, by the way, I wasn't worried about the LDL, and I want to talk more about that. I know that there's LDL, total LDL doesn't really mean much. I did the NMR profile to kind of look at the particle sizes, but do you put any emphasis on the LDL? Or is that just one little piece of the puzzle when you're looking at the lab work?
Yeah, that's just one little piece of things. And I don't think, I haven't seen anything that has convinced me or even made me question whether or not LDL could cause atherosclerosis on its own. Like, I don't think there's any way that it could. It always has to have other things happening in the body before it can contribute to that. But even then, it doesn't cause it. It's just this innocent bystander that the body uses to help repair that situation. But yeah, so just looking at one marker, LDL, and saying, like, I think it's really short-sighted to look at this one blood marker, which blood is only one tissue in the body. It's a very small, sample of what's going on in the body. It's also just one marker in it. And to think that this one thing's going to cause disease is really short-sighted. And, disease is multifactorial. Any disease is. And so to be focused on that, to fearful of that number, without looking at it in the context of everything going on in the person's life and the rest of blood work and other testing, it just doesn't make sense to me. And unfortunately, there's a whole, aspect of medicine that's so focused on that number. And I think that it has really done a disservice to a lot of people.
I agree. I see it all the time with my YouTube comments. Oh, my doctor looked at my LDL and it was XYZ. He wants to put me on a statin. Even worse than that, they don't even look at the LDL. They just look at total cholesterol and they're like, you got to go on a statin. Is there any, I've never seen it. I don't know if you have. Is there any research that shows total cholesterol really means anything when it comes to heart disease?
I want to pause this interview real quick and say thank you so much for reaching this point of the interview. If you're getting any value so far, hit the thumbs up button on this video down below and check out the subscribe button here on the channel. If you're not subscribed to the Keto Camp YouTube channel as of yet, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you're notified when we go live, release a brand new video. We do that 2 to 3 times per week. I want to take a few seconds here to get to the sponsor of this episode, which is Upgraded Formulas. If you're anything like me, you probably spend quite an amount of money on supplements every single month. Wouldn't it be great if you knew you were absorbing those supplements or not absorbing those supplements? What I'm bringing you today is an exciting new opportunity to test the accuracy of the supplementation, the vitamins and the minerals, if they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. After all, you can't be a biohacker without testing, can you? In this case, I'm referring to Upgraded Formulas, upgraded hair test kit and consultation. It's very easy to do this test. It's a kit that's sent to you. You would just use hair from your body. It could be head, it could be body, it could be pubic hair. You send in your hair and then you get a consultation and you review which supplements you should be taking versus which supplements you shouldn't be taking. How well are you absorbing that? And this will be a great way to discover why you just don't feel so well. Even if you're taking all these supplements, but you still feel tired, you still have symptoms. This will give you the exact picture on what you should do next to correct that issue. I love upgraded formulas. I had Barton Scott on my podcast, the Keto Camp podcast, before. We have an exclusive offer for you to get 10% off your hair mineral analysis kit and any of their amazing supplements, which are highly absorbed. Head to upgradedformulas.com. Use the coupon code BEN10, that is BEN10, at checkout to get 10% off today. We will also drop a link down below for you. That's upgradedformulas.com. Use the coupon code BEN10. All right, let's get back to this incredible interview.
Not that I've seen, no. But interestingly, the levels, like if we talk about LDL specifically, they want it to be lower than 100. That's what the recommendation is nowadays. But it started out like 250 was fine. Then they wanted it lower than 200, then lower than 150, and now it's lower than 100. This is what the recommendation is. And so to me, that tells me that we really don't know what it's supposed to be. But interestingly, there was a study came out not too long ago that looked at a lot of different things. One of the things they looked at was LDL. And I wish they looked at total cholesterol too, but they didn't in the study. They looked at LDL and HDL and other things. But the LDL, they looked at that and how it associated with all-cause mortality. So dying from anything pretty much. And it's just an associational study, so we can't say it proves anything. But the levels of LDL that associated with the lowest death from anything were between like 117 and 160. And so the recommendation is to have it below 100. And the level of LDL that associated with the highest all-cause mortality was lower than 84. So it's interesting to see that, considering that the idea that we need to lower cholesterol is based on studies that show that associations that higher cholesterol is worse for heart disease. We have other studies that show these associations that higher is better for dying, for not dying from anything, so just conflicting things. So when that kind of stuff happens, you just kind of have to throw it all out or just take it into consideration, but you can't draw conclusions from that. We can't move forward with treatment strategies with that information.
What about the role of statins? So let's say somebody's listening right now and they're taking a statin, they want to get off of it. Can you just describe how statins interfere with the process of actually making cholesterol in some of those pathways, and what can the person do to get off the statins?
Yeah. So the statins work by inhibiting the production of cholesterol, and there's like this 20-step process taking a fatty acid and making cholesterol, and statins interfere with like the second step, so very early on in the process. And the problem with that is that, well, first of all, you don't get cholesterol in the end, so your body doesn't make cholesterol, which is important for lots of different things. But the other issue is that your body uses some of those intermediates, like those different steps, those molecules in those different steps, for lots of other things. Like it uses it to actually prevent vascular calcification. It uses, I think it's farnesylpp, and I think also it uses it to make selenoproteins, which are like precursors to antioxidants. So there's always different things. It uses one of the molecules to make another molecule called dolicol, which is really important for the health of our insulin receptors. So if we don't make that, which is statins, prevent the making of that. That's why statins have been shown to increase risk for type 2 diabetes, because we get unhealthy insulin receptors, we get insulin resistance. And so there's all these things that it's interfering with, and that's why we get this long downstream effect of side effects from statins. And so, getting off of them, first of all, people want to get off their statins, go talk to your doctor.
Yeah.
Give them information and say, hey, I'd like to get off of this, and see what they say. If they're not willing to help you get off of it, then maybe it's time to find a new doctor. But you have to do that through them. But yeah, I mean, the goal should never to be to make someone dependent on a medication. So if your doctor is saying that, oh, you have high cholesterol, it's probably genetic, you need to take this drug the rest of your life, that's not good healthcare, in my opinion. first of all, if the patient wants to do that, then fine. But also, you should be educating the patient on all the different things. It's called like, when you give someone a treatment, you kind of have to give them the risks. You have to give them the alternative treatments. You have to give them all this information, and it's just very rarely done. Like most of the time, because they don't know lots of the risks or the alternatives. They don't know how to lower cholesterol if that's something that's desired. They don't know how to do that other than a statin drug. And so this whole bit of information that's supposed to be given to patients is not necessarily happening. And so patients think they have one option, and they have to do that. And if they don't, they're going to have a heart attack. And so now they're living in fear. Yeah. And it's kind of like this not necessarily guilt, but just this fear-based agreement to the treatment. When there's lots of different opinions about if we want to actually lower cholesterol or not, but then also lots of other ways that if you wanted to lower your cholesterol, you could, if that was what you desired.
Yeah. So, I mean, you would say instead of focusing on lowering cholesterol, focus on lowering inflammation. Is that an accurate thing you would recommend?
Definitely. I would, if I had a choice between, what thing to treat, would it be the LDL, the insulin resistance, the inflammation? Insulin resistance will come first. Treat that first, because likely when you treat that, the inflammation is going to go away too. Mm-hmm. But if inflammation is still there, there's other reasons for that. Then you treat that, and if you treat those two things first, I don't think it really matters too much what your LDL is. It's there doing its job, and the only reason that it becomes problematic is because of things like insulin resistance and inflammation that cause damage to the LDL molecules. Those lipoproteins, because once they're damaged, then they can become problematic as well. But it's not them, it's not their fault. It's the things that damage them that's causing the issue. And that's the things that cause inflammation. So things like stress, toxin exposure, poor metabolic health, that kind of stuff. But I do think, and this is kind of a theory, I don't, I'll say that up front. Like, I do think that, say someone had really high cholesterol, like total cholesterol or LDL, and they were also in a very inflamed state. Let's say they smoked and drank or lived an extremely stressful lifestyle. In that sense, I think having higher LDL might be bad, because when you're in that state, those things are damaging the LDL, and the damaged LDL particles are also damaging other things, like a chain reaction, So having more of them around could just lead to this whole crazy situation where the tissue's just getting damaged. But in the absence of that, there's even some things that suggest that higher LDL could be beneficial. So it's all in the context of the health of the human. So if you're just looking at LDL, you're missing the boat.
Yeah, so important. I always say that it's a full picture you want to look at. It's all of those inflammatory markers, how you feel, total LDL, yeah, whatever, but HDL, triglyceride, get the ratio, do the calculations that you mentioned, and then you can make a decision. Is this a problem or is it fine? I mean, I knew for me, even though I had really high LDL after even before the 40 days of carnivore, I had high LDL, but even higher after that. But all my inflammatory markers were optimal. My A1C was optimal. My fasting insulin was optimal. My IR was optimal. It's like, okay, I'm good with this. I feel good. And that's the full picture we want to look at. Real quick on the topic of statins, and even those who are not taking statins, what about CoQ10? Do you recommend somebody who takes statins take CoQ10? Or what about somebody who doesn't take statins? What role does CoQ10 play with heart health?
Yeah, CoQ10 is super important because it all boils down to that mitochondria, like we talked about in the beginning. CoQ10 is really important for the functioning of the mitochondria, and like one of the last steps of it, where it's transporting those electrons down this chain to make the ATP at the end. It's really important in one of those mechanisms there. And so, yeah, I think it's important to be taking that, or at least getting it through your diet, regardless of if you're on a statin or not. I think that's incredibly important. But I guess especially if you're on a statin, you want to be increasing the health of the mitochondria, regardless of that. That's the key thing. And then ask yourself, like, is the problem the cholesterol that I'm lowering, or is the problem that I don't have enough CoQ10? Like, so why am I taking this one thing, especially because I'm on a statin, or was that the problem in the first place? It's kind of backwards thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So how do you get it from diet if you don't supplement with it? What foods have it?
I mean, red meat's a good source.
Hmm.
I'd say liver is a really good source if you do want to do organ meats, but you could also um, uh, supplement, freeze dried organ meats. Make sure you get a good brand. There's plenty of people doing that now. But like I said, those foods, very nutrient dense, very bioavailable forms of these nutrients that you're going to absorb way more readily than in any supplement form.
Your book was something I learned a lot of things that were new, but one of the things that I learned was that the heart is actually not the main mover of blood in the body, and you have a different explanation of the heart. So can you explain that and just go into depth on the physical heart and how it actually works in the body?
Yeah. So, you know, most people think, and medical students are taught, I was taught that, the heart is this forcefully pumping organ that pumps the blood throughout the entire body. And yes, there's help from the contraction of muscles, and there's one-way valves in the veins that keep the blood going in the direction that we want it to. But when you look at the physics of it, there's actually no way that a heart the size of ours could pump blood throughout the entire body with enough force to get it all the way back to the heart. I mean, if you think about it, if I was going to pump water up a hill, where would I put the pump? At the bottom of the hill, so I could pump water up the hill, right? I wouldn't put the pump at the top of the hill, have the water come down the hill so I could pump it back up the other side, right?
Makes
And
sense.
so it makes no sense that the heart is forcefully moving blood, especially in the veins, because that's the water coming back up the hill after it's gone down the hill. And so we have to look at this in a different light. And so there's actually quite a bit of evidence that, like early evidence, that blood can move on its own. There's these really interesting studies in the 40s and then repeated in the 60s that showed that when they stopped the hearts of dogs, sorry for all the animal lovers, but when they did that and they inject tracers into the blood and they accounted for like the ventilation of the lungs and everything, that the blood still moved despite the dog's heart stopped, not breathing, anything like that. The blood still moved for up to 2 hours after the dog had died. And so people, will say, well, how is that possible? How does the blood keep moving? Especially if the heart's not contracting and the valves aren't opening, and how is this happening? And it's happening because water, which our blood is about half water, has these unique properties that it can absorb energy from the environment. And it can do that from lots of different energy sources. But the number one way that the number one frequency or wavelength of energy that it can absorb is infrared light, which the natural source of that is from the sun. Like 40% of the sun is infrared. Um, and so when it has a sufficient energy, water will do these very unique things when it gets next to water loving surfaces. So it will actually start to structure itself. And by structure, I mean like it kind of just like, we have three phases of water, solid, liquid, gas. There's actually kind of a fourth phase, which we've called structured water or exclusion zone water or fourth phase water. And it's kind of like between solid and liquid. It's kind of like a gel. Think like Jello or like gelatin. When you refrigerate your bone broth, it turns
Yeah.
back in this gelatin state. It's that kind of consistency. And so this actually happens. This has been proven at a lab at University of Washington. That actually happens on the lining of our blood vessels. So again, the blood is about half water. So if our bodies are sufficiently energized, when it gets next to the hydrophilic surface of the lining of an artery, it actually structures itself. And the way that it structures itself, without getting into all the details, it actually creates an energy gradient because of how the ions, position themselves when the structuring happens, and this energy gradient drives flow. And it's been shown that this can happen indefinitely as long as energy is applied to the system. And so that's how the main way the blood moves. It's kind of on its own. It's kind of the self-propelled mechanism because of these unique characteristics of water. And so when we think about it in that aspect, that the blood is moving on its own, we have to think about the heart as something. Well, first of all, like, why is it there? What is it doing then if it's not, forcefully pumping blood? And so we have to think about something else that, that we know of, that it's sort of like a pump, but it operates, it's flow based, or it's flow operated, meaning water or liquid is flowing into it, and that's the only time that it really operates, is when water is flowing into it. And so the thing we know of in engineering for that is a hydraulic ram, or hydraulic ram pump. And so this operates when water is flowing from a higher place, like a reservoir, coming down into the hydraulic ram. And when it does that, it does these mechanisms using physics to get the liquid in there and then pumped up somewhere else or moved somewhere else. And in reality, the heart, it does do a little bit of pumping when it contracts, but no more than is enough to get the blood kind of moved through the heart. There's no way that it could, pump it all the way around the body. But it's interesting then to think about, so why is the heart there? And the first reason is that there's a few different ways that you can, increase the energy that water absorbs. And one of them is, like I said, infrared light. You could also do grounding, but another one is actually, it's been shown that when we spiral water, like you vortex it in the presence of oxygen, it actually energizes it. And so it's no accident that the heart is oriented. The muscles of the heart are oriented in a spiral, twisting like fashion. When the heart contracts, it spirals like this, not just contracting like that. It's spiraling. And so there's multiple places as the blood moves through the heart that it gets actually vortexed. And there's always oxygen present, even in the veins. There's still lots of oxygen in that blood, and it's more oxygenated when it goes through the lungs and comes back to the heart. But then it's getting spiraled every time it goes through in the presence of oxygen. So that keeps it energized to an extent. So when it gets back into the arteries, it can structure itself on the lining of the artery and then continue keeping the blood moving. So in a way, the heart is responsible for moving the blood, just not in the way we thought. And then the other really key purpose of the heart has to do with why it's situated where it is. Why is it right in the middle of the arteries and the veins? Because if we were to, so like increased blood flow happens when tissues demand the blood. So if we go for a run, tissues are demanding blood, and it starts surging toward the tissues in the arteries, going towards the tissues. And if we were to go for a run and we didn't have a heart there, then all the blood would surge over to the arterial side of things, to the tissues, and the venous side wouldn't have enough pressure, wouldn't have enough fluid in there to stay open, so it would collapse. However, the heart is actually there kind of as a stopgap, maintaining the pressure between the two systems, making sure there's enough fluid in both sides so that the venous side doesn't collapse when we're exercising, which is really, really important, because if it did, we would die. And so in that sense, the heart is not necessarily it's not this thing that we think of like a pressure propulsion pump, where it takes stagnant water from somewhere, sucks it in, and then forcefully pumps it out another way. Fluid is already flowing into it, and it's actually in times where the fluid is flowing very fast, it's one of its roles is to actually slow it down. It's kind of damming it up a little bit so that we don't lose the even pressure between the two systems. Because like I said, if we did, it'd be a disaster.
So fascinating. Yeah, we're not taught that. We haven't been taught that at all. So I love that viewpoint on it. And your book goes a little bit deeper. If you want to really understand it, I recommend getting the book. So the sun, you mentioned the sun. I'm a big fan of getting sunshine every single day. I'm blessed to live in Miami, where there's a lot of sun here. You would say that getting adequate sunshine helps with this process based off of what you shared.
Definitely. Yeah. So lots of people, there's all this talk about vitamin D, and that's, important. We definitely get that from the sun. But there's interesting studies that would show that the benefits of like when they were looking at the benefits of sunlight to cardiovascular disease, they were like, oh, it's got to be the vitamin D. So they supplement with vitamin D, and they didn't see the same benefits. It's because not all the benefits are from vitamin D. They got to think about, like, we've been so caught up in like the biochemical side of the body, which again is important, but there's this whole, I call it like the physics side of us, that we need to pay attention to as well. Are we in the right physical environment that's going to give everybody the right stimuli to stay healthy. And one of those things is sunlight.
So you've seen association studies that show those who are in areas that don't get much sun have higher incidences of heart disease?
Yeah, definitely.
Huh. Yeah, I was thinking that when you were sharing about the sun. Great. And then something I learned, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I interviewed an anti-aging doctor, Dr. Sandra Kaufman, who wrote the Kaufman Protocol. She's actually based out of South Florida. She shared with me from her research that astaxanthin is like edible sunscreen, preventing you from getting burned from the sun, meaning you could be out there even longer and get these benefits without the negative consequences of getting burned. So have you ever looked into that or heard about that before, the astaxanthin component?
I've heard about these things, and I've heard like that, and just like general like antioxidant type things in general. Like because the damage that comes from the sun is when the antioxidant properties of our body get overwhelmed because there's too much damage coming in, and they can't counteract it, and then that's when we burn. So you're more resistant to burning if you have higher, or if you have more of that stuff around to counteract the damaging effects of the sun. And I mean, that sounds like a great theory, and it sounds pretty good. I haven't really seen anything to fully back it up, like biochemically, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case.
Yeah, anecdotally, I've seen that with taking it versus not, and also giving to some clients and then them seeing some results. But yeah, nothing really concrete scientifically, but it's fascinating thought. So those who are putting toxic sunscreen on, they're wearing sunglasses, you're not going to get the benefits we're talking about here. Get the natural sun. And if you can't, I have a big 4 panels right here of red light therapy. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. Any way we can, because in our modern world, we can't always do I don't expect everybody to go and live out in the woods again. That's not realistic within our modern world. So there are things we can do, like the red light therapy or infrared saunas and that kind of stuff that can help us kind of get our body in that right physical environment a little bit better.
Great. Yeah, I'm a big fan of red light therapy. I do it daily, along with sunshine. Even overcast days, you'll still get benefits even if it's overcast when you're outside, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, people don't get that, especially those in London. You could still get benefits. As we wrap up here, we have a few more minutes. I do want to discuss the role of industrial seed oils, vegetable oils in heart disease, and ask you this question. What do you think is worse and will cause heart disease faster? Eating a high carbohydrate diet, so having elevated insulin and glucose, or eating vegetable oils that are these processed fats every single day? Which one will get you to heart disease faster?
I think the vegetable oils, definitely.
Yeah. Why?
Because when you burn, like when your body uses primarily polyunsaturated fats for fuel source, like within the mitochondria, it's in the cell and in the mitochondria, it actually kind of like derails the metabolism in a way that ultimately causes insulin resistance, and that's a much quicker path than have your body having to deal with just ups and downs in blood sugars. That may, I don't know. I think the jury's still out whether or not if you completely eliminated vegetable oils and you just ate this processed carbohydrate diet, I would wonder how long it would take before we saw like the same repercussions we would if we were eating the vegetable oils too. Because in my opinion, the vegetable oils are like lighting the fire, and then the processed carbohydrates are just adding more fuel, like kindling to the fire. So it'd be interesting to see like studies where you flesh those out and to see like what was more damaging and how long it took one to be as damaging as the other. But yeah, so when we burn those polyunsaturated fats, primarily those, because red meat has polyunsaturated fat in it too. Like it's not like polyunsaturated fat is a bad thing. It's just that the amounts we're eating it is a really big problem, because we're supposed to have the right ratios, and the ratio is totally off. And so when you burn those, it breaks your metabolism. It damages it damages the certain intermediates in the Krebs cycle, and then it leads to actually lower oxidative stress, which sounds like a good thing, like right there in the mitochondria. But that's actually the wrong signaling, because free radicals are signaling molecules, and they're supposed to tell your cell certain things, like when to stop burning fuel. And if you break that, you don't get that signaling because there's not enough oxidative stress being produced to send that signal for it to shut down. It just keeps happening and keeps happening and keeps happening. And pretty soon the cell's overwhelmed. You're getting signals across the whole body to be resistant to insulin. And it's just a disaster. And that's exactly what's happening for people in today's world.
Yeah, they are ubiquitous. I agree with you. I always say, look, if you're having high carbohydrates and getting those glucose spikes and insulin spikes, if you're active, you could burn that off, right? But if you're taking these vegetable oils, these PUFAs in high amounts, you're not going to be able to burn that off as efficiently as the glucose. It's just going to really create a lot of inflammation. Dr. K. Shanahan always says, PUFAs go poof, right? The amount of oxygen it attracts, it just creates problems with the double bonds. I was interviewing Dr. Benjamin Bickman. Are you familiar with this work?
Yeah.
Yeah. This morning I'm doing a keto challenge. And I knew, because he's the insulin guy, of course, he's looking at a lot of research with glucose. So I wanted to kind of be, I didn't want to debate him because I love Dr. Bickman, but I wanted to bring a different perspective. So I said to Dr. Bickman, and this is a hypothetical, so it's kind of hard to kind of get the exact science here, but I said, Dr. Bickman, I told the challenge members in my keto challenge that I would rather you eat a high carbohydrate diet with very low vegetable oils than a ketogenic diet with a lot of vegetable oils. And I said, would you agree with that? Or would you think that's the wrong way of thinking? And he said, well, if you put it that way, hypothetically, I would agree with you. And then he went into kind of what you explained, the peroxidation and the pathways and how it could lead to insulin resistance. So a lot of people are not aware in the keto space. I know we are. But in the keto space, even educators in keto, they're teaching keto, but they're teaching it the wrong way. And I want you to kind of just drill it one last time. Like, how important is it for us to minimize these bad fats, and what are some better alternatives for them?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think, one of the big issues with the Atkins diet. You know, it was successful for a lot of people, but it allowed vegetables because they were low carb, you know, and so, but it created a lot of issues for people. But yeah, it's incredibly important. I mean, when you think about it, you know, these seed oils, I don't know why they're called vegetable oils, these seed oils, you know, around, you know, early 1900s, they first, you know, became part of the food supply, and they just like, you know, infiltrated every single aspect of the food supply. And we see the trends, and it's not the only thing, but we see the trend, because this is an association like of heart disease during that time started to increase. And by the 1950s, everybody was freaking out about it and didn't know what to do. And then Ansel Keys gave us an answer of it was cholesterol and saturated fat, which was the wrong answer. But when you look at the trends, when we started eating higher amounts of polyunsaturated fats, heart disease, obesity, diabetes just skyrocketed. So that was, again, not the only thing, but a major player. And the evidence is right there. So we got to get those out of our diet. And so the way we do that is, you know, if you're eating at home and you're not using vegetable oils, then you're doing good, you know. But it's eating out or eating any kind of packaged or processed food, like it's gonna have vegetable oil, and it's almost guaranteed.
Yeah.
And
so
then
how do you handle the restaurants? What do you do with the waiters and waitresses personally?
you ask them, you know, I mean, I don't really order many processed things from a restaurant, but if I go and I get a steak or something, I say, what was this cooked in? Like how did you cook this? How did you prepare this? And that kind of stuff. And sometimes I get good answers, sometimes I get bad answers.
Yep.
And sometimes I end up fasting. But
you know what I do, Stephen? I tell them if they say it's like a soybean oil or something bad, I say I'm allergic to that. Do you have butter or coconut oil or even olive oil? And they usually do, or I'll fast like you.
See, my question would be like, when they go back to them, tell them that does the cook go and clean off the whatever they're cooking on, or do they just throw some butter on there on top of all the soybean oil and cook it in that? Like, I don't know. But I guess,
but if they didn't, I mean, in small amounts, if you're doing so many things right, it shouldn't be that detrimental in theory, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we don't need to be that scared of it to where you're going to that extreme. You know, if you're eating out once a week or something, and they cook it in some butter, but there's also a little soil, like that's not going to kill you. You know, tomorrow. So you have to live your life. You have to enjoy your life too. That's very important. Do the best you can. As long as you're doing the best you can, like that's all you can do, right? But then, like, you know, people also have to be careful too, because they think, you know, oh, I'm buying olive oil or avocado oil, but that stuff has been shown to be heavily contaminated with vegetable oil or seed oils. And there was one study that even showed that I think some brands of avocado oil have almost 100% canola oil in them.
It's crazy.
It's just false advertising. So I don't know how they're allowed to get away with that. So you got to be careful with those things too. Make sure you do your research if you consume those foods, that you're getting a brand that's being truthful. And then replace those oils with good healthy animal fats like butter and ghee and tallow and lard and what have you.
Lard, look at that. I talk about it and people are like, what? This guy's crazy. What do you mean lard? Yes, lard. It's stable. We're looking for the stability of the fats. That's great. Stephen, do you have 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. There was something I wanted to cover that we didn't cover. You mentioned you have 3 big kind of keys for achieving health. You mentioned metabolic flexibility, healthy metabolism, which is what we should really be speaking about when we talk about the coronavirus anyways. Reducing oxidative stress and inflammation, you talked about it, but there was one thing we didn't talk about: balancing the autonomic nervous system. If you could explain what exactly that is, and then relate that to what you shared in your book about mammals and reptiles and how we have the difference in those nervous systems.
Yeah. So this is a really big point of mine because, oftentimes the conversation on heart disease is dominated by diet and inflammation and that kind of stuff. But, this is part of that as well. But I think that the more and more I learn, I think that imbalance in the autonomic nervous system is actually a bigger driver of heart disease. And so when my people say like, oh, his diet gave him heart disease, I don't believe it for a second, because that's only one little part of it. And there's so many other things, and this is one of them. And so the autonomic nervous system is the system our body uses to interpret the environment and give our body signals if we're in a safe or threatening environment. So should we have a stressful response, like to get away from a threat, like run away or fight it off, or are we safe and our body can focus on digesting and detoxification and things like that, sleeping. And so, based on what signals we're getting, it's going to give us the appropriate response. However, our stress response evolved in a certain way, which I'll talk about in a minute. But our environment changed so rapidly that there's no way that it could have evolved to this new environment that we have, this, I would say, high demand, unnatural stressor environment of the human beings have kind of created for themselves. And so what that often leads to is we get stuck in this stress state. It's almost like your body's constantly getting signals to have this stress response, like we're constantly in a threatening situation. And so that's problematic. And one of the biggest reasons that happens is because humans are the only species on the planet that can literally think their way into a stress response. We can overthink something. We can see something happen to somebody else across the world and fear it's going to happen to us. We can have something bad happen to us. And instead of, forgetting about it in a day or two, like lots of animals do, we think about it for months or even years. And these types of things can lead to us thinking our way into the stress response. And the reason I think that's really important, I mean, everybody talks about how like stress and heart disease is definitely related, but it's just kind of like this afterthought thing. It's like, oh yeah, I manage your stress, but I think it needs to be the forefront because of how the stress response evolved in mammals. So in reptiles, when we talk about the vagus nerve, which the vagus nerve is the nerve that communicates these signals and tells your body which state to be in, the stress or non-stress state. And when we talk about reptiles, they have this one pathway of the vagus nerve. It's called the dorsal motor nucleus. And it basically, that's their stress signaling response. And if they have a stress response that is, I guess, too overwhelming, they actually their body can actually shut down organs because they're so much less metabolically active than mammals. If you think about reptiles, they're slower moving, they're cold-blooded. They just don't have this high metabolism that mammals do. So in order for mammals to evolve from reptiles, which they did eventually, there had to be this split in the vagus nerve. So there's still that older dorsal motor nucleus there, but there's also this nucleus ambiguous. There's two pathways in the vagus nerve. And what that allows for is it allows for mammals to have this stressful response without an organ shut down. Like the reptiles have, because the reptiles could have that, and since they're so much less metabolically active, their organs won't die or anything. Whereas if mammals had that shutdown response, they require so much more ATP and maintain this body temperature that they would not be a good situation for different organs or the body as a whole. And so in order to have that stress response, we needed this dual pathway that can kind of prevent that shutdown pathway from happening. However, there are situations, and this is what I talk about when I talk about how our physiology, like our environment changed so rapidly, our stress state environment changed so rapidly. There's no way that our stress response physiology could adapt to that change. And so there is situations where we can get stuck in this stress state, and it can have a profound effect on our metabolism, on our organs, and ultimately what I talk about in the book is how it can lead to what I call shifts in metabolism, metabolic heart attacks that happen where there's no blockage whatsoever in a coronary artery, but we still get tissue death, and which happens way more frequently than people think. I can't tell you the number of people that have reached out to me and said, "Yeah, I had a heart attack," and they never found a blockage, and they couldn't tell me why it happened. And I believe that, my theory is that this is the kind of things that happens, and it has to do with imbalances in our stress response.
So fascinating. Another reason why we want to master our stress: turn off the news, open up a book, do things that are going to activate oxytocin and dopamine. Not too much dopamine, but oxytocin. We want to stay out of this stress response, because you're so right. And stress comes in three areas: the mental, emotional, which you spoke about, physical, and then of course chemical toxicity wise. So we want to look at all three areas and focus on reducing that, because it will lead to issues. I mean, Dr. Bruce Lipton has shown that your thoughts create a frequency that penetrate your membrane, tell your DNA to produce a specific protein. And it could be an inflammatory protein with a bad thought, or it could be a healthy protein with a positive thought. And we have that power. It's our greatest power. I always say, the ability to choose your thoughts. So well said, Stephen. Where is the best place to go check you out, get your book, learn about you on social media?
My website is resourceyourhealth.com. That's where my blog's on there. My books are available. That's where I do my health coaching. The heart book is not available right now because I got picked up by a publisher.
Oh, sweet. Congrats.
Thanks. And so we're working to, make changes and improvements on it to get it republished to the publisher. So I'm hoping by early next year it'll be out, but we'll see. So yeah, the best way to kind of get updated on that process is to follow me on social media, which is Dr. Stephen Hussey on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And if you do that, then you'll be notified of the timeline for when that's going to be out again. But I also have another book called The Health Evolution that is available right now.
And that's on Amazon?
Yes.
The other one? Okay, we'll put that down below. That's exciting. Congrats on the publisher, man. Well deserved. Well deserved. It's going to bless even more lives when it's repackaged. You're amazing. I love the work that you're doing. I learned so much from you, from your work prior to the interview, and then of course on the interview. Thank you for speaking the truth about the heart and about red meat and about the nervous system and just all your years of research. I personally appreciate it, and I know my audience does as well. So I look forward to having more conversations with you and doing more discussions to hear about your research. And I want to thank you for coming on the show, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It sounds like you're doing awesome things, so I'm happy to be a part of it.